I learned that I had been banned from the family yacht trip the same way you learn that a door has been locked behind you, not by a knock or a warning, but by the silence where your name used to be. I am Grace Lee, 27 years old, married for 3 years, and erased without conversation. The invite disappeared first, then my name vanished from the group messages, and finally, a photograph surfaced online showing champagne flutes raised on a deck I had paid for. The part that still stings is not that they excluded me, but how calmly they did it, as if my absence required no explanation at all. I stood in my kitchen that morning with a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching sunlight crawl across the counter, trying to convince myself that this was a misunderstanding, that families sometimes forget that I should wait for my husband to say something. He did not. I scrolled again slower this time, counting faces, counting smiles, counting the ease with which I had been replaced. I remember thinking that if humiliation made a sound, it would be quiet like a ceiling fan turning in an empty room. I did not cry. I did not shout. I felt something heavier settle in my chest, a certainty that this was deliberate. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Family tradition continues," and I understood then that they were not just taking a trip without me. They were rewriting a story and leaving me out of the narrative entirely. When my husband walked past me toward the door, keys in hand already late for work, he kissed my cheek and said nothing about the trip, and in that moment his silence landed harder than any argument ever could. I asked him if he had seen the post. He shrugged and said his sister handled logistics and that I should not read too much into it. The words were soft, reasonable, and devastating. I asked him why my name was gone, and he told me not to make a scene, that I always took things personally, that it was probably a mistake. That was the first twist of the knife, the suggestion that my reaction was the problem rather than the action that caused it. I watched him leave and realized that this was not new, only clearer. His sister had always decided who belonged and who did not, and he had always let her. I sat at the table and opened my email more out of habit than hope. And there it was, a confirmation notice from the charter company thanking me for releasing my cabin. The request had been submitted days earlier, approved without my consent, signed with her name. My hands did not shake as I read it. I felt a calm that surprised me, the kind that arrives when confusion finally gives way to truth. They had not forgotten me. They had removed me. I printed the email and laid it flat on the table, smoothing the paper as if it might wrinkle under the weight of what it meant. For years, I had tried to be agreeable, to earn my place by being patient, by staying quiet when jokes cut too close, by excusing the way my presence was treated as optional. I had built a company from nothing before I turned 26, signed my first major contract with a pen borrowed from a stranger, and bought that yacht with money I earned line by line. Yet inside this family, I was still framed as a guest, a +1, a woman who should be grateful for proximity rather than ownership. The exclusion was not loud, but it was precise, and it carried an unspoken message about power. That morning I realized something else as well. I was not angry because anger would have meant surprise. What I felt was clarity. If they were willing to erase me so easily, then I no longer owed them my silence. I owed myself the truth, and I owed it to myself to stop asking for permission in a place where I already had proof. I folded the email and placed it in a folder I kept for documents that mattered, the ones that did not rely on memory or goodwill. As I closed the folder, I made a decision that felt final and steady. I would not confront them yet. I would not plead or explain. I would watch, document, and wait. They thought they had locked me out. They had no idea I was holding the key, and that when the moment came, the door would open in front of everyone. After that morning, life did not collapse the way movies suggest it should. There was no dramatic argument, no suitcase packed in a rush, no tears streaking down my face as I slid down the kitchen cabinets. Instead, the day continued with an almost cruel normalcy which somehow made everything sharper. I rinsed my mug, wiped the counter, and straightened a chair that did not need to be straightened because routine was the only thing keeping my thoughts from spiraling. Our house was quiet in the way a space feels after someone leaves the room mid-sentence. The silence was not peaceful, it was unfinished. I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop, pretending to check work emails while my mind replayed my husband's shrug over and over again. Ethan was 34, successful enough by other people's standards, polite in public, and endlessly non-committal in private. He had a way of speaking that made conflict sound inconvenient rather than urgent, as if emotional harm were a scheduling issue instead of a moral one. When we first married, I mistook that calm for stability. Now I recognized it as avoidance. By noon, he texted to ask what we were having for dinner, not whether I was all right, not whether I had questions about the trip I had just been erased from. I stared at the message longer than necessary, noticing how easily he compartmentalized discomfort, how practiced he was at stepping around problems rather than through them. I typed a neutral response, something about leftovers, and felt a flicker of shame at how quickly I defaulted to keeping the peace. This was the shape of our marriage more often than I liked to admit. There had been other moments, smaller ones that I had brushed aside because they did not leave marks you could point to. His sister Vanessa correcting me in front of others when I spoke about my own business. Vanessa laughing when I suggested a holiday schedule that did not revolve around her. Vanessa introducing me as Ethan's wife, who helps out sometimes as if my life were an accessory to his. Each time, Ethan had smiled and said nothing later, telling me that I was too sensitive, that his family just had strong personalities, that it was easier not to push back. Easier for whom was a question I had stopped asking out loud. That afternoon, while the sun shifted and shadows crept across the living room, I remembered the first time I felt truly small in their presence. It was at a dinner 2 years earlier when Vanessa casually asked if I was still working on my little project, and Ethan laughed and said I liked to stay busy. I had corrected him gently, said it was not a project but a company, and the table went quiet for half a second before conversation moved on without acknowledging my words. Ethan never apologized for that. He told me later I should not embarrass him by contradicting him in front of his family. That memory returned now with uncomfortable clarity, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. This was how exclusion worked in our lives. It did not arrive with slamming doors or raised voices. It arrived through minimization, through silence, through the steady erosion of recognition. When Ethan came home that evening, he moved around the house as if nothing had changed, dropping his bag by the door, loosening his tie, asking if I had paid the utility bill. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, noticing how relaxed he seemed, how unburdened. I asked him again about the trip, not with anger, but with a calm that made him uncomfortable. He repeated that it was probably a mix-up, that Vanessa handled everything, that confronting her would only create drama. When I showed him the printed email, he barely glanced at it. He said paperwork could be misleading, that people made mistakes, that I should not jump to conclusions. His voice stayed even reasonable, almost kind, and that was what made it hurt. There was no room in his response for the possibility that I was right. There was no curiosity, no instinct to protect me from being wronged. Only a quiet insistence that harmony mattered more than truth. As he walked away to shower, leaving the conversation unfinished, I understood something essential about the dynamic I was in. I was expected to absorb discomfort, so others would not have to feel it. I sat alone at the table again, the printed email between my hands, and felt a resolve begin to replace the ache. This was not just about a trip or a sister-in-law with a talent for exclusion. This was about what happened when the person who vowed to stand beside you chose neutrality instead. And neutrality, I was learning, always sided with the person who already held the power. The next morning confirmed what my instincts already knew, because exclusion rarely travels alone. It brings witnesses. I woke to a notification from a cousin on Ethan's side, someone I barely spoke to, posting a story tagged with the marina's location. The image was polished and deliberate, a long table set on a sunlit deck. Name cards placed with careful symmetry, champagne already poured even though the trip had not officially begun. I zoomed in, not because I wanted to hurt myself, but because I needed certainty. There it was, the guest list displayed casually on the table, each name printed in elegant script. Vanessa Cole, Ethan Lee, their parents, an aunt who once told me boats made her nauseous, a friend of Vanessa's who taught yoga and had asked me the year before if I worked for my husband. And then the empty space where my name should have been. Not crossed out, not smudged, simply never there. That was the moment the exclusion shifted from private to public. It was no longer a misunderstanding handled quietly behind closed doors. It was a statement made in daylight, visible to anyone willing to look. I felt my chest tighten, not with panic, but with recognition. This was intentional, curated, and meant to be seen. Vanessa had always understood the power of presentation. She did not just remove people, she replaced them, creating a cleaner picture without the inconvenience of explanation. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed again this time, with a message from Vanessa herself. "Hey, Grace, just realizing there might not be room for everyone this year. Things filled up faster than expected. Hope you understand." She added a smiling face at the end, the kind that softened the words without changing their meaning. I read it twice, then a third time, noticing what it did not say. There was no apology, no suggestion of making it right, no acknowledgement that I was part of the family at all. Just a polite dismissal dressed up as logistics. I did not respond. I set the phone down and let the silence stretch, resisting the urge to defend myself, to explain why I deserved to be there. That urge had been trained into me over years of subtle correction, and I recognized it now as a reflex I needed to break. Instead, I opened my calendar and scrolled back through the past year, marking each moment I had been quietly left out. The holiday brunch I learned about through photos, the birthday dinner planned on a night Ethan said they were staying in, the charity event Vanessa hosted where my name was absent from the invite list, even though I had helped her plan it. Each omission alone could be excused. Together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. In the afternoon, Ethan called from work, his tone light, as if checking in out of obligation rather than concern. He said Vanessa mentioned the trip again and that it sounded like things were just tight this year. I asked him if he had seen the guest list photo. He paused, then said he did not think it was a big deal, that Vanessa liked to keep control over details, that I should not read malice into everything. The word everything caught my attention. It suggested this was not the first time he had minimized something that mattered to me. I told him I had proof the cabin had been canceled days earlier. He sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced by a problem he did not want to solve. He said families were complicated, that confronting his sister would only escalate things, that I needed to trust him to handle it. Handle it had become another word for delay. After we hung up, I sat very still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I realized then that Vanessa was not just excluding me. She was testing how far she could go without resistance, and Ethan, by refusing to challenge her, was answering that question for her. The humiliation I felt was sharp, but beneath it was something steadier taking shape. If they wanted to make my absence public, then I would stop protecting their comfort in private. I gathered the screenshots, the email confirmations, the timestamps, and placed them carefully in the folder I had started the day before. This was no longer about being invited. It was about being erased with a smile, and I understood that the only way to confront that kind of cruelty was not with louder emotion, but with undeniable truth. That afternoon was when the gaslighting truly began, not loudly, but with the careful patience of someone confident she would never be challenged. Vanessa followed her message with a voice note, her tone light, almost cheerful, as if she were talking about a misplaced sweater rather than a deliberate exclusion. She said she felt terrible about the confusion, that the charter company must have misunderstood instructions, that these things happened all the time when dealing with family trips. She laughed softly at the end, a sound meant to disarm, and told me she hoped I was not upset, because that would just break her heart. I listened to the message twice, then once more, not because I doubted what I heard, but because I wanted to understand the strategy behind it. She never said she was wrong. She never said she would fix it. She framed the situation as unfortunate, external, and emotionally burdensome for her, positioning herself as both organizer and victim. It was a familiar pattern, one I had seen play out in smaller ways for years. When someone questioned her, she responded with wounded innocence, forcing them to comfort her instead of holding her accountable. I felt the pull of it even now, the instinct to reassure her, to say it was fine, to absorb the discomfort, so things could return to normal. That instinct was powerful, and recognizing it frightened me more than her message ever could. I forwarded the voice note to myself and labeled the file with the date and time. Then I sat back and tried to remember the first time I had been made to feel unreasonable for reacting to something that hurt. It came back to me in fragments. Vanessa once joking that I was sensitive when I asked her not to comment on my appearance in front of others. Ethan telling me his sister did not mean anything by it, that I should lighten up. His mother suggesting I was misinterpreting a remark because I did not grow up around their family dynamic. Each time the conclusion was the same. The problem was not the behavior, it was my perception of it. That is how gaslighting works. It does not deny reality outright. It nudges you into doubting your own ability to read it. By early evening, Ethan came home carrying takeout and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said Vanessa had called him that she was stressed and overwhelmed, that planning trips was harder than it looked. He told me she felt attacked and that he hoped I would not make things worse by pressing the issue. Worse was his favorite word whenever I asked him to choose a side. I asked him calmly why my cabin had been canceled days before any supposed confusion. He rubbed his forehead and said I was focusing on details that did not matter. That sentence landed harder than anything else he said. Details were the only things that mattered because details were where the truth lived. He told me families needed flexibility, that I should be patient, that Vanessa was doing her best. I asked him whether he believed she would have removed his name the same way. He did not answer. Instead, he told me I was being unfair and that my tone was accusatory. In that moment, I saw the shift clearly. The conversation had moved from what she did to how I reacted. My feelings had become the problem to manage. I stood there listening to him speak and realized that this was not an argument I could win by being reasonable, because reason was not what he was asking for. He was asking for compliance. He wanted me to accept an explanation that contradicted the evidence in front of me, so he would not have to confront his sister or examine his own silence. When I finally stopped him and said I needed space, he looked surprised, as if that option had never occurred to him. I went into the bedroom and closed the door, something I rarely did, and sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hands. I read Vanessa's message again, then the email from the charter company, then the screenshot of the guest list. The contrast was undeniable. One version was polished and soothing. The other was factual and cold. I understood then that gaslighting only works when you do not keep records. Memory can be argued with. Documents cannot. I took a deep breath and felt the confusion that had been hovering at the edges of my thoughts finally lift. In its place was a quiet certainty. They were not mistaken. They were lying carefully, and they expected me to help them do it by doubting myself. I would not. I added the voice note transcript to my folder, labeling it clearly, and closed it with intention. I was done asking whether my feelings were justified. The question no longer mattered. What mattered was that I could now see the shape of the manipulation clearly, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That night was when the situation crossed from quiet cruelty into something darker, something that carried weight and consequence beyond hurt feelings. Ethan did not raise his voice at first. He never did. He waited until after dinner, until the dishes were stacked and the television murmured in the background, until the moment felt small enough to dismiss later if necessary. He asked me why I was still upset. The word "still" was deliberate. It implied that my reaction had an expiration date, that my pain was an inconvenience lingering past its usefulness. I told him calmly that I was not upset anymore, that I was paying attention. He frowned at that as if attention itself were a provocation. He said I was overthinking things again, that his sister had a lot on her plate, that I did not understand how his family worked. When I said I understood very well, that was when his tone shifted. He accused me of trying to create conflict, of always looking for reasons to feel excluded. He said I made things tense, that my presence made his sister uncomfortable, and that perhaps this break from the trip was for the best. The words landed slowly one after another, each one erasing a little more ground beneath my feet. I asked him if he heard himself. He told me not to twist his words. I told him I was not twisting anything, I was repeating them. That was when he stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, a sharp sound that cut through the room. He said I needed to drop it, that I was acting irrational, that if I kept pushing, I would regret it. He did not say how. He did not need to. The threat lived in the implication, in the way his body filled the space between us, in the way he looked past me rather than at me. I felt my heart begin to race, not because I was afraid he would hit me, but because I recognized the tactic. Intimidation does not always arrive with fists. Sometimes it arrives as dominance, as control, as the expectation that you will shrink. He told me I should be grateful for what I had, that I had married into stability, that my work was fine, but it was not the same as family money, and that I needed to remember where I stood. That sentence changed something fundamental in me. Where I stood, as if my place were assigned rather than earned, as if my silence were the price of admission. I told him to step back. He scoffed and said I was being dramatic. Then he did something small and revealing. He picked up my phone from the counter and placed it face down on the table. "We do not need distractions right now," he said. That was when I understood that this was not just emotional neglect. It was control. He was used to managing situations by minimizing them, by deciding when conversations started and when they ended, by framing my responses as excessive so he would never have to address the cause. I took my phone back without raising my voice and told him he did not get to decide what I needed. His jaw tightened. He said if I kept digging into this nonsense, it would affect our finances, that joint decisions required trust, and that trust was fragile. The implication was clear. Money was leverage. He reminded me that some accounts were under his management, that big decisions required consensus, that I should think carefully before escalating things with his family. There it was. The line he had never crossed before, now spoken aloud. I felt a cold clarity wash over me, the kind that arrives when fear is replaced by understanding. This was not about peace. It was about power. He wanted me quiet because my silence made his life easier. I told him I was going to bed. He followed me down the hall, continuing to talk, telling me I was blowing things out of proportion, telling me I would ruin our marriage over something trivial. I turned and looked at him, then really looked and saw not a partner trying to protect harmony, but a man protecting his position. I closed the bedroom door between us and locked it, something I had never done before. My hands were steady as I sat on the bed, listening to his footsteps retreat, listening to the house settle into uneasy stillness. I did not cry. I felt resolved. The fear I had felt earlier transformed into something else entirely. A recognition that whatever came next, I could not go back to pretending this was normal. This was how abusive dynamics often lived, not in visible bruises, but in threats disguised as concern and control, disguised as calm. I opened my folder again and added a new note writing down everything he had said, the time, the wording, the shift in his behavior. Documentation was no longer just strategy. It was protection. As I turned off the light, one thought anchored itself firmly in my mind. If this was how he behaved when I questioned exclusion, then the truth I was uncovering threatened more than a trip. It threatened the balance of control he relied on, and that meant the next move mattered more than ever. The truth was that none of this had started with the yacht, and once I allowed myself to see that memories I had carefully filed away began to surface with unsettling clarity. Vanessa Cole had never liked me, not in the loud, obvious way that would have been easier to confront, but in the measured, evaluative way of someone deciding whether another person deserved space in her world. I remembered the first holiday I spent with Ethan's family when Vanessa asked where I was from and nodded politely before remarking that I did not sound like I came from money. Everyone laughed as if it were a harmless observation. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, a silent request not to react. Later, he told me she was just curious, that she did not mean anything by it. That phrase followed me through the years like a refrain. She did not mean anything by it. At family gatherings, Vanessa positioned herself as the center of gravity, organizing schedules, assigning seats, narrating events as if she were the authority on who mattered and why. She decided which stories were retold and which were quietly dropped. When I spoke about my work, she redirected the conversation toward Ethan's job or their parents' investments. When I mentioned a milestone I was proud of, she responded with a compliment that minimized it, calling my success impressive for my age, as if achievement were an exception rather than the rule. Each interaction left me slightly off balance, questioning whether I was imagining the slight or simply failing to fit in. That uncertainty was the point. I thought about the dinner 2 summers ago when Vanessa hosted a fundraiser at her house. I had helped her plan, it made introductions, even covered a shortfall without telling anyone. During her speech, she thanked Ethan for his support and praised the family for their generosity. My contribution went unmentioned. When I asked her later if she had forgotten, she laughed and said it was not about credit, it was about community. Ethan told me not to take it personally, that recognition did not matter if the cause was good. I swallowed my disappointment and told myself that generosity did not need applause. What I did not admit was how often that logic was used to justify my invisibility. There were other moments too many to count now that I allowed myself to count them. Being left off email threads that included everyone else. Finding out about trips and dinners after the fact. Being told plans changed when in reality they had simply moved forward without me. Each time, Vanessa offered a smooth explanation, and Ethan offered a reason not to challenge it. Together, they formed a system that trained me to doubt my instincts. The pattern became clearest when I thought about Ethan's mother, who often watched these interactions without comment. She never corrected Vanessa. She never defended me. She maintained a careful neutrality that preserved the hierarchy as it was. Silence, I realized, was a family language. It communicated approval without the risk of accountability. That understanding reframed everything. This was not one sister acting alone. It was a family structure that rewarded control and punished disruption. Vanessa thrived in it because she enforced its rules. Ethan survived in it by avoiding conflict, and I had tried to belong in it by shrinking. The realization was painful, but it was also freeing. I was not failing to earn my place. The place had never been offered on equal terms. That night, lying awake in the locked bedroom, I felt the weight of that truth settle in. I thought about my own upbringing, about parents who taught me that respect was mutual, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing was a choice, not a virtue. I had built my life around that belief, built a company, built independence, built security. Somewhere along the way, inside this marriage, I had abandoned it in the name of harmony. Seeing the family dynamic clearly forced me to confront how deeply I had compromised myself. The yacht exclusion was not an accident. It was an escalation. It was Vanessa asserting dominance in a way she believed would go unchallenged, supported by a family accustomed to looking away. And Ethan's behavior that night confirmed that he expected me to accept it, to absorb the discomfort so the system could remain intact. As the hours passed, my fear receded, replaced by resolve. I understood now that any response rooted in emotion would be dismissed as overreaction. The only thing that would disrupt this pattern was something it could not ignore: facts, records, consequences. I reached for my notebook and began to write not just about the yacht, but about years of quiet exclusion dates, locations, witnesses. I was not collecting grievances. I was mapping a pattern. By the time the sky lightened with the approach of morning exhaustion pressed in, but clarity held. This was no longer a question of belonging. It was a question of power, and for the first time, I was no longer pretending I did not see how it was wielded. The first hard proof arrived the next morning, not with drama, but with the unmistakable language of logistics, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. I was standing at the kitchen counter scrolling through emails while the kettle heated when I saw the subject line from the charter company again. This time, it was not a confirmation, but a follow-up notice, the kind companies send automatically when a request has already been processed and closed. It read, "Cabin release completed. No action required." My name appeared in the body of the email paired with a date and a timestamp that made my stomach tighten. The request had not been recent. It had not been rushed. It had been submitted 4 days earlier, approved the same afternoon, and finalized before I had ever seen the photograph online. That alone dismantled every excuse I had been given. This was not confusion. This was planning. I clicked through the attached details, slowly reading each line as if I were reviewing a contract, because that was effectively what this was. Requester Vanessa Cole. Relationship to booking family coordinator. Reason for cancellation guest list adjustment. The phrase was so clinical it almost made me laugh. Guest list adjustment. A person reduced to a line item removed with a drop-down menu. I printed the email and placed it beside the first confirmation I had saved, aligning the pages carefully so the dates were visible. Side by side, they told a story no one could argue with. The silence of the house felt heavier as I stood there, papers in hand, aware that I was holding something that shifted the ground beneath me. This was the kind of evidence that did not rely on tone or interpretation. It existed regardless of how anyone felt about it. I took photos of the documents with my phone, then saved the files to a secure folder in the cloud, labeling them clearly. I emailed copies to myself from a separate account, creating a trail that could not be erased by a single device. It felt methodical, almost detached, but beneath that calm was a pulse of anger sharpened by relief. For the first time since this began, I was no longer questioning whether I had imagined things. The truth was documented. I texted Ethan to let him know I had received additional confirmation from the charter company. I did not accuse. I did not editorialize. I simply stated a fact. His reply came several minutes later. He said this was getting out of hand, that I was digging for problems, that Vanessa would be hurt if she knew I was collecting emails like evidence. Evidence. The word echoed in my mind as I read his message. He was not denying what had happened. He was objecting to my refusal to let it disappear. That realization settled quietly but firmly. I did not respond. Instead, I added his text to my records, noting the time and his choice of words. The kettle clicked off behind me, steam curling into the air forgotten. I sat at the table and stared at the documents again, thinking about how often women are taught to prioritize peace over clarity, harmony over truth. This was what that training looked like when stripped of its politeness. I thought of Vanessa's voice note, of Ethan's insistence that details did not matter, of the family's practiced silence. All of it depended on one thing: my willingness to let the moment pass. I folded the papers and slid them into the folder with care, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical one. These were records now, not emotions. As I closed the folder, I felt something shift inside me, a subtle but decisive movement away from uncertainty and toward action. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. If they believed they could remove me quietly, they were mistaken. Quiet did not mean powerless. It meant deliberate. And from this point forward, every step I took would be grounded in proof, not persuasion. The tension in the house changed after that email, settling into something thick and watchful, like air before a storm that refuses to break. Ethan did not apologize. He did not ask questions. He began to monitor instead, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. He asked where I was going when I picked up my keys. He wanted to know who I had spoken to during the day. He commented on how much time I spent on my phone, on my laptop, on anything that pulled my attention away from him. None of it was loud or explosive. It did not need to be. Control rarely announces itself. It tests boundaries quietly, waiting to see how much resistance it will meet. That evening, while I was reviewing invoices for work, he stood behind my chair and read over my shoulder without asking. I closed the file and turned to face him. He said he was just curious, that as my husband, he had a right to know what was going on. The word right hung between us, heavy with implication. I told him calmly that my work was my responsibility. His smile tightened. He said marriage meant transparency, and transparency meant I should not be hiding things. I reminded him that he had not been transparent about the yacht cancellation. His face hardened at that. He told me to stop obsessing, that I was creating problems where there were none, that my fixation was unhealthy. Then he reached past me and shut my laptop. The click of it closing sounded louder than it should have. My pulse jumped, not because I felt threatened in that moment, but because I recognized the escalation. This was no longer about dismissing my concerns. This was about limiting my access, my movement, my autonomy. I stood up slowly and told him not to touch my things. He scoffed and said I was overreacting again, that he was trying to help me calm down. Help. It was always framed as help. When I walked past him to put space between us, he blocked the doorway with his arm, not grabbing me, not pushing, just standing there, forcing me to stop. He asked where I thought I was going. I said I needed air. He told me I could calm down in the living room. The choice was an illusion. I felt my throat tighten as I realized how quickly the situation had narrowed. I told him to move. He did not. He said we needed to talk this through now that I was being unreasonable, that if I left the room it would prove I was unstable. That word again, unstable, pressed against me like a weight. I took a slow breath and met his eyes. I told him to move or I would call someone. For a moment something flickered across his face, surprise, calculation, then annoyance. He stepped aside with a dismissive gesture, as if indulging a child. I walked past him without running my back straight, my hands steady, even though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. In the bathroom, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening to my own breathing. This was how it happened, I realized. Not all at once, not with violence you could photograph, but with moments that made you question your instincts, moments that forced you to choose between compliance and escalation. I texted a friend to let her know I might need to stay with her soon. I did not explain. I did not need to. When I came out, Ethan acted as if nothing had happened. He sat on the couch scrolling through his phone, his tone casual as he asked if I wanted to watch something together. The normalcy was disorienting. It was meant to be. If I accepted it, the moment would dissolve, leaving no trace. I did not accept it. I went to the bedroom and began packing a small bag, not in secret, not in a rush, just enough to assert that I had options. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his voice sharp now, asking what I thought I was doing. I told him I was giving us both space. He laughed without humor and said I was being dramatic again, that leaving would make things worse, that his family would see this as proof that I was difficult. There it was, the threat of narrative. Not physical harm, but reputational damage. Social isolation, the rewriting of events to cast me as the problem. I zipped the bag and told him I was not responsible for how others interpreted my boundaries. His expression changed, then anger flashing through the calm he worked so hard to maintain. He told me if I walked out, I should not expect things to be the same when I came back. I told him they already were not. I left the room and sat on the edge of the bed to put on my shoes, aware of every sound, every movement, every possible outcome. He stood there watching me, silent now, and I understood that this was a turning point. The dynamic we had lived in depended on my willingness to yield. By choosing not to, I was disrupting something he relied on. As I picked up my phone and keys, I felt fear. Yes, but it was edged with something stronger. Resolve. I added the details of the encounter to my notes later that night, describing the blocked doorway, the closed laptop, the language he used. It was not an act of paranoia. It was an act of clarity. Abuse did not need bruises to be real. It needed patterns, and I could see them now. This was no longer just about a yacht or a family trip. It was about my safety, my autonomy, and the cost of staying silent in a situation that was tightening around me. I spent that night at a friend's house, lying awake on a couch that smelled faintly of laundry soap and old books, staring at the ceiling while my thoughts arranged themselves into something orderly for the first time in days. Fear had been loud earlier, but distance quieted it enough for logic to step in. I understood now that reacting emotionally would only feed the story they were already preparing, the one where I was unstable, dramatic, difficult. That narrative was ready-made, and if I played my part in it, they would not even need to try very hard. So I chose something else. I chose strategy. Before sunrise, while the house was still dark and my friend slept down the hall, I opened my laptop and created a document titled Timeline. I did not write how I felt. I wrote what happened. Dates, times, names, words used. I listed the yacht cancellation, the email confirmations, Vanessa's voice note, Ethan's responses, the blocked doorway, the closed laptop. I wrote in neutral language, the kind that could stand up to scrutiny. When I finished, I read it back to myself and felt a steadiness settle in my chest. This was not a story anymore. It was a record. I backed it up in 3 places and then closed the file. I did not check my phone until mid-morning. There were several messages from Ethan, their tone swinging between concern and irritation, asking where I was, telling me we needed to talk, warning me not to make decisions while emotional. I did not reply. Silence, I realized, could be a tool when used intentionally. I made coffee, sat at the small kitchen table, and planned my next steps as if I were advising a client rather than salvaging my own life. First, safety. I would not be alone with Ethan until I had clarity and support. Second, independence. I reviewed my accounts confirmed, which were solely in my name, and noted where changes would be required. Third, verification. I needed to understand exactly what I legally owned and under what conditions those rights could be asserted. The yacht was central not because of its value alone, but because of what it represented. It was the asset they were most invested in, controlling the symbol they were most determined to keep me away from. That meant it was also the lever they least expected me to pull. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney recommended by a colleague, someone known for precision rather than theatrics. I did not tell Ethan. I did not tell anyone in his family. I understood now that information was currency, and I had spent too much of it trying to be transparent with people who did not return the courtesy. By the time the sun was fully up, my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. She said she was worried about me, that Ethan mentioned I had left that family disagreements could get blown out of proportion, and that she hoped I would not let stress damage relationships that mattered. The message was careful, sympathetic, and strategic. It framed my departure as instability and positioned her as concerned mediator. I did not respond. I added the message to my records and noted the timing. It arrived after the cancellation was finalized, after Ethan had confronted me after I had left. It was not concern. It was containment. I closed my eyes and took a long breath, feeling the clarity sharpen rather than dull. The mistake they were making was assuming that my quiet meant indecision. In truth, it meant preparation. I had spent years building things from the ground up, learning how to read contracts, how to anticipate resistance, how to move deliberately when stakes were high. Those skills did not disappear because the battlefield had shifted to my marriage and my in-laws. They applied even more now. I packed my bag with intention, choosing documents over clothing, chargers over cosmetics, evidence over comfort. When I left my friend's house later that morning, I did not feel triumphant or vengeful. I felt focused. I was done asking whether I belonged. The question had changed. It was no longer about whether they would include me. It was about when they would realize that exclusion had consequences and that the version of me willing to absorb harm for the sake of peace was no longer available. The story I had avoided telling myself for years finally demanded space the moment I sat alone with my attorney's intake form open on my screen. It asked simple questions about assets, ownership, and income, but answering them forced me to confront a truth I had minimized out of loyalty and fear. I had built my company before I turned 26, not with inherited money or family connections, but with contracts I negotiated myself and nights I spent sleeping on office couches when cash flow tightened. I remembered my first major client meeting, the way the room went quiet when I introduced myself and stated my terms without apology, the way one man smiled as if indulging a child and then changed his expression when I refused to budge. That was how I learned that calm could be more disarming than force. Over 4 years, I scaled the business carefully, reinvesting profits, turning down flashy shortcuts, choosing stability over spectacle. When the numbers finally crossed a threshold that felt unreal, I did not celebrate publicly. I did not announce anything. I bought the yacht, quietly signing papers with a steady hand, viewing it as a symbol of earned independence rather than luxury. It mattered to me that no one could claim it had been given to me. I paid the down payment from my personal account. I handled the inspections. I chose the name. Somewhere in the process, I made a decision that would later become the fulcrum of everything unfolding now. At the advice of an accountant recommended by Ethan's family, I added Ethan's name to the ownership structure, not as a controlling partner, but as a co-owner for tax efficiency and estate planning. It was framed as practical neutral, beneficial to both of us. I remember signing the addendum without hesitation, trusting that marriage meant shared interests, that legal formality did not alter moral reality. That trust felt naive now, not because I believed marriage should be adversarial, but because I had underestimated how easily paperwork could be used to rewrite a narrative. Once Ethan's name appeared on the documents, the yacht slowly transformed in family conversation. It became something Ethan had, something their family shared, something Vanessa referred to as part of their legacy. I noticed the shift the first time she raised a glass and thanked her brother for providing such a beautiful space for family tradition. I corrected her lightly afterward, reminding her that it was mine as well. She smiled and said, "Of course," but the language never changed again. Over time, I stopped correcting it. I told myself it was not worth the friction, that recognition mattered less than peace. Sitting there now, rereading my own words on the intake form, I understood how costly that decision had been. Silence had allowed others to speak for me. I pulled up the original purchase agreement and read it closely, line by line, something I had not done since the day I signed it. The structure was more nuanced than I remembered. My contribution was listed first. My account funded the transaction. Ethan's inclusion was conditional, tied to marital status and conduct clauses I had barely glanced at because they seemed theoretical at the time. One clause in particular caught my attention, its language precise and unmistakable. In the event of material exclusion or interference with use by a co-owner, sole control could revert to the contributing party pending review. My pulse quickened not with excitement, but with recognition. This was not a loophole. It was a safeguard I had unknowingly built into my own future. I requested a full copy of the finalized documents from the brokerage and flagged the clause for my attorney's review. As I waited, I thought about how often women are encouraged to downplay their authority to preserve relationships, how competence is recast as intimidation, how silence is mistaken for consent. I had allowed my role to be softened until it fit comfortably into someone else's story. The yacht was never just an asset. It was proof of my capacity to build and own something without permission. That was why Vanessa wanted control over it, why Ethan bristled when I asserted boundaries, why the family framed my presence as optional. Control of the symbol meant control of the narrative. When the email arrived with the full documentation attached, I felt the final piece slide into place. The ownership clause was real, it was enforceable, and it required nothing from me but clarity and timing. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. This was not about winning. It was about refusing to be erased by paperwork I had once trusted others to interpret for me. I closed my laptop and sat back, letting the weight of what I now knew settle in. They believed the contract protected them. They believed my quiet meant compliance. They were wrong on both counts. For the first time since this began, I understood exactly where I stood, not emotionally, but legally, and that knowledge changed everything. Understanding the clause did not bring me relief so much as accountability, because it forced me to acknowledge the role I played in creating the situation now unfolding. I had not been careless, but I had been generous in a way that assumed good faith would always be returned. Adding Ethan's name to the contract had felt like a gesture of unity at the time, a way of signaling that I believed in us as a team. What I had not considered was how quickly a team becomes a hierarchy when power dynamics go unexamined. After the yacht purchase, small comments began to surface that I dismissed too easily. Ethan referring to it as ours in conversations where I was not present. Vanessa calling it a family asset at dinners, saying things like, "It is so nice when success stays in the bloodline." Each remark landed lightly enough to ignore, but together they reshaped the story. I remembered the first time I objected directly. We were driving home from a weekend visit, and Vanessa had thanked Ethan for hosting such a generous trip. I corrected her, reminding her that the yacht was mine as well. Ethan had laughed and said it was semantics, that everyone knew what she meant. Semantics became another way to erase ownership. Over time, the way they spoke about the yacht hardened into assumption. It was no longer something I had built. It was something I had married into. Sitting with that realization now was uncomfortable but necessary. I had allowed the narrative to drift because pushing back felt petty, because I did not want to seem territorial or difficult. In doing so, I had underestimated how narrative shapes entitlement. When people believe something belongs to them long enough, they stop asking permission. That is how Vanessa could cancel my cabin without hesitation, how Ethan could justify it as logistics, how the family could accept my absence without question. They were operating inside a story where I was an accessory, not an authority. The clause in the contract exposed the fragility of that story. It was written in plain language, unambiguous, triggered by actions that interfered with my access and use. Cancellation of my cabin qualified. Removal from the manifest qualified. Framing the yacht as a family asset while excluding me qualified. The law did not care about intentions or feelings. It cared about conduct. I forwarded the relevant pages to my attorney with a brief note asking for confirmation. Her reply was concise and definitive. Yes, this applies. Yes, it can be enforced. Yes, you have leverage. Reading those words did something unexpected. It did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel grounded. Leverage was not about domination. It was about balance. It restored a measure of equity that had been quietly stripped away. I thought about Ethan in this new light, about how his reluctance to confront his sister had merged with a growing comfort in the authority she claimed. By staying silent, he had benefited from her control without having to take responsibility for it. The moment I questioned that arrangement, he reacted not with curiosity, but with threat. That reaction made sense now. My awareness endangered a structure that worked for him. That did not make him irredeemable, but it did make him accountable. I did not know yet what I would do with the clause. Enforcement was not a decision to be made impulsively. Timing mattered. Context mattered. The public nature of the exclusion mattered most of all. If they wanted to handle this quietly, they would have included me quietly. They chose visibility. That meant any response would also be visible. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the late afternoon light. The clarity I felt was steady, not sharp. I understood now that my mistake had not been trust itself, but unexamined trust, the kind that assumes shared values without verifying shared behavior. The contract did not betray me. It protected me, waiting patiently for me to read it closely. The mistake was believing that silence preserved harmony. In reality, it had preserved imbalance, and imbalance, once exposed, demands correction. The second receipt arrived by accident, which was fitting because truth often slips through the cracks of arrogance rather than force. I was reviewing documents at a quiet cafe when an unfamiliar email address appeared in my inbox with no subject line, just a forwarded thread and a brief note that read, "I think this was meant for someone else." The sender was a former assistant of Vanessa's, a woman I recognized from past events. Polite, efficient, and always positioned just close enough to hear things she was never meant to repeat. My pulse stayed steady as I opened the attachment. Inside was a chain of messages between Vanessa and a private consultant, Date's clearly visible tone unguarded in the way people become when they believe an audience is controlled. Vanessa wrote that the yacht situation needed to be handled cleanly, that optics mattered, and that it was important Grace not be present for this trip. She referred to me by first name, only stripped of title, stripped of relation, and then came the line that settled everything. She is not blood, and she should not be treated like ownership. Reading it felt like stepping into cold water, shocking but clarifying. This was not exclusion disguised as oversight. This was intent. She continued explaining that once patterns were established, people accepted them, and that if I missed one trip quietly, future adjustments would be easier. Easier. The word echoed with the casual cruelty of someone confident in their leverage. The consultant replied with a caution about documentation and suggested minimizing written records. Vanessa responded that it was already handled and that family would back her. I sat back in my chair and let the noise of the cafe wash over me while I read the thread again, slower this time, noting the language, the assumptions, the certainty. This was the missing piece. Not just what happened, but why. The narrative they were building was deliberate, strategic, and rooted in a belief that my role was conditional. I saved the email, downloaded the attachments, and forwarded copies to my attorney with a single sentence asking for assessment. Her response came within the hour. This establishes intent. Preserve it. The weight of that statement was significant. Intent transformed a personal dispute into something measurable. It stripped away plausible deniability and exposed motive. I thought about Ethan in this context, about how often he had told me Vanessa meant well, that I was misreading things. This thread proved otherwise. Whether he knew the specifics or not, he had benefited from her actions and defended them reflexively. That did not absolve him. It implicated him. I considered calling him, then confronting him with the evidence demanding answers. The impulse passed quickly. Confrontation would give him time to prepare, to coordinate, to minimize. Strategy required restraint. I returned home later that afternoon and found Ethan already there, moving through the house with forced normalcy, asking if I wanted dinner, commenting on the weather. I watched him for a moment, seeing him now with clearer eyes. This was a man accustomed to smooth surfaces, to problems being absorbed by someone else. I did not disrupt that comfort yet. I went to the bedroom and added the new receipt to my folder, labeling it, carefully noting dates, participants, and key language. I printed a hard copy and placed it behind the cancellation emails, building a sequence that told a coherent story without commentary. Action, response, intent. The structure mattered. That evening, Vanessa texted again saying she hoped I was feeling better and that family gatherings could be emotional. She suggested we talk after the trip, once everyone had cooled down. The timing was precise. After the trip. After the pattern was established. I did not reply. I added the message to my records. By then, the emotional charge of the situation had shifted. Hurt was still present, but it no longer drove my decisions. Clarity did. I understood that Vanessa's confidence came from believing she controlled the room, the narrative, and the loyalties. What she underestimated was documentation. She believed family dynamics operated outside formal accountability. The receipts proved otherwise. As I closed the folder that night, I felt something settle into place. The evidence now showed not just exclusion, but design. And design carries responsibility. The next phase would not be about whether they had wronged me. That question was answered. It would be about how and when the truth would be revealed and what consequences would follow once it was. The moment that crystallized everything did not come from another email or document, but from a voice carried confidently through someone else's microphone. I was folding laundry when a notification popped up from a lifestyle podcast Vanessa often appeared on, one I had listened to before out of a misplaced sense of obligation. I did not intend to press play. Curiosity did it for me, the quiet kind that wants confirmation more than comfort. Vanessa's voice filled the room warm and assured, talking about tradition, about the importance of family continuity, about how certain assets anchor a legacy when they stay within the bloodline. She spoke as if she were reading from a script she had rehearsed for years, pausing for effect, smiling through phrases that sounded generous while drawing sharp lines beneath them. Then she mentioned the yacht. She called it a symbol of their family's story, a place where generations connected, where values were passed down. She thanked her brother for making it possible and praised the family for preserving something meaningful. My name was not mentioned. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate omission that matched the pattern perfectly. Listening to her, I understood that the yacht was never just about leisure or luxury. It was a prop in a narrative she was determined to control. By excluding me physically, she had begun excluding me rhetorically. The podcast made it official. This was the story she wanted the public to believe, one where I did not exist as a builder or owner, only as a temporary presence easily edited out. I paused the episode and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a familiar ache rise and then recede. Hurt had been replaced by something steadier, a recognition of stakes. Legacy was not a sentimental concept here. It was currency. Whoever defined it held power. Vanessa understood that instinctively, and she wielded it with confidence. I thought about how often she spoke about blood, about lineage, about who belonged and who did not, always cloaked in language that sounded protective rather than exclusionary. The moral twist of it struck me then. She framed her actions as preservation, as if erasing me were an act of loyalty rather than theft. That framing depended on one thing: silence. As long as I remained quiet, her version of events would stand uncontested. I opened my folder and added a transcript of the podcast, highlighting the section where she spoke about ownership and legacy. Words matter when they are repeated publicly. They shape perception. This was no longer just a family matter. It was reputational. I forwarded the transcript to my attorney, noting that the statements conflicted directly with documented ownership. Her reply was brief. "This supports misrepresentation. Keep it." I sat back and let the significance sink in. Misrepresentation was not just rude or unfair. It carried consequences. The podcast episode continued to circulate, gathering comments and praise, reinforcing a false narrative that benefited Vanessa and diminished me. Each share strengthened her claim in the public eye. She was betting that I would choose discretion over correction, that I would accept being written out to avoid appearing confrontational. She underestimated how much I valued accuracy. That evening, Ethan mentioned the podcast casually, saying Vanessa sounded great, that it was nice to see his family represented so well. I asked him if he noticed that she credited him for the yacht. He hesitated, then said she probably did not mean anything by it, that podcasts simplified stories for audiences. Simplified. Another word for erased. I did not argue. I noted his response and let the silence do the work. In that moment, I understood that this was not just about asserting my rights. It was about correcting a moral wrong. Allowing someone to claim what they did not build was not generosity. It was complicity. I had spent too long confusing the two. As I turned off the light that night, the path ahead felt clearer. Vanessa had taken the narrative public. She had framed exclusion as virtue. That choice narrowed her options and widened mine. The truth now had an audience waiting for it whether she realized it or not. The legal consultation did not feel dramatic, and that was precisely why it mattered. I sat across from Margaret Collins, 52, composed precise, the kind of attorney who listened more than she spoke in an office that smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. I handed her the folder without commentary and watched as she read page by page, eyes moving quickly, pen-tapping once when something registered as important. She did not interrupt me with reassurances or questions about my feelings. She asked for dates. She asked for sequences. She asked for whether I had access to the yacht at the time of the cancellation and whether that access had been materially interfered with. When I answered yes, she nodded once and turned to the contract. She read the clause I had flagged and then read it again aloud, slowly enunciating the language as if placing it into the room where it belonged. In the event of material exclusion or interference with use by a co-owner, sole control shall revert to the contributing party pending review. She paused and looked at me. "This is not ambiguous," she said. "It is specific. It anticipates exactly this scenario." I felt my shoulders lower an inch. Margaret continued explaining that the clause existed to protect the party who bore the financial risk, that it was triggered by conduct rather than intent, and that documentation mattered more than explanation. She asked whether the cancellation had been initiated by someone other than me. I said yes. She asked whether my husband had opposed it. I said no. She asked whether the exclusion had been repeated publicly. I said yes and handed her the podcast transcript. She underlined a sentence and said, "This compounds it. Misrepresentation paired with interference strengthens enforcement." The language was clinical, but the effect was profound. What had felt like a personal betrayal was being translated into enforceable reality. Margaret outlined options without pushing me toward any single outcome. We could send notice privately. We could assert control quietly through the marina. We could wait and assert publicly if circumstances warranted. Timing, she emphasized, would determine impact. If the other side believed the trip would proceed without me asserting control at the point of departure, would create clarity that could not be undone or reframed. I asked her whether doing so would escalate matters. She smiled faintly and said escalation had already occurred. They just expected you to absorb it. She advised me to preserve every communication to avoid confrontation until the moment of assertion and to ensure any interaction occurred in the presence of neutral parties. She also asked about my safety at home. I told her about the blocked doorway, the closed laptop, the implied financial threats. She did not minimize it. She suggested documenting and considering a temporary protective plan if needed. Her tone was calm, but the implication was serious. Control and intimidation, she said, often escalate when leverage is threatened. I left her office with a plan that was both simple and exacting. We would not announce anything in advance. We would not warn Vanessa or attempt to correct her narrative privately. We would allow the trip to proceed to the point where my absence was assumed, where the story had momentum. Then we would assert the clause cleanly through the marina and the captain, using language that left no room for argument. Sole ownership. Clearance required. No theatrics. Facts only. Margaret drafted a short notice to be held until needed, addressed to the marina and copied to the brokerage, instructing them to recognize my authority pursuant to the clause. She asked me to review it for accuracy, not tone. Tone, she said, was irrelevant. Authority was not. As I drove home, the city blurred past my windows, and I felt the strange calm that comes when preparation replaces uncertainty. This was not revenge. It was correction. The law was not a weapon here. It was a boundary. Back at the house, I packed a small overnight bag and placed my folder inside, choosing clothes that were neutral and practical. This was not a performance. It was a presence. Ethan texted asking where I was. I replied that I would be away for a bit and that communication would be limited. He called. I did not answer. Vanessa posted another update about final preparations, tagging the marina and thanking the crew. I watched without reacting. The clarity Margaret had given me made patience easier. Every assumption they made about my absence was an investment in a lie that would soon be called. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I confirmed logistics with Margaret in the marina using concise language and written confirmation. The captain replied, acknowledging my authority and noting that clearance would be requested before departure as standard procedure. Standard. The word mattered. It meant the process was routine, not personal. As I closed my laptop, I understood that the next move would not be loud. It would be procedural. And procedure, once initiated, does not bend for ego. The point of no return arrived disguised as celebration delivered through a screen while I stood at a quiet counter stirring coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Vanessa went live just after noon, her phone angled perfectly to catch the light. The marina behind her arranged like a postcard. She spoke with practiced ease about gratitude, about tradition, about how important it was to protect what mattered most. She thanked the crew by name, thanked the sponsors who had commented hearts and clapping hands, thanked her family for showing up early. She did not mention me. She did not have to. The absence was the message. She said they were keeping things simple this year. Blood only. No distractions, just legacy and love. The words landed with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to her. I watched without blinking, noting the timing, the phrasing, the audience numbers ticking upward. Comments poured in praising her values, her leadership, her devotion to family. Each comment reinforced the lie. Each share invested more people in a version of events that excluded me entirely. I felt the familiar pull to intervene, to correct the record before it calcified. I did not. This was exactly what Margaret had warned me about. Let the assumption settle. Let the belief harden. The clearer the lie, the cleaner the correction. Vanessa smiled into the camera and said, departure would be tomorrow morning, that the captain was finalizing details, that everything was set. Everything was not set. That was the truth she did not know yet. When the live ended, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. He said Vanessa was upset that I had not responded to her, that people were asking questions about why I was not there, that my silence was making things awkward. Awkward was another word for inconvenient. I replied once calmly, saying I was aware of the schedule and that logistics were being handled. He asked what that meant. I did not explain. Explanations invite negotiation. Facts do not. I forwarded the live recording to Margaret and noted the statements about blood and departure. She replied with a single sentence confirming it strengthened our position. The afternoon passed slowly, deliberately. I checked in with the marina by email to reconfirm that clearance would be requested from me prior to departure. They responded promptly, acknowledging standard procedure and confirming my status as sole decision authority pending review. Pending review was fine. Authority in the moment was all that mattered. I packed my bag carefully, documents first, then clothing that would not draw attention. I chose a simple dress, flat shoes, no jewelry beyond my ring. This was not about spectacle. It was about presence. As evening approached, Ethan called again. His voice was tight, controlled. He said Vanessa felt attacked, that the family was confused by my behavior, that leaving things unresolved before a public event was irresponsible. He asked me to please just talk to her, to smooth things over so the trip could proceed without drama. Drama was his word for accountability. I told him there would be no conversation tonight. I told him he would understand soon. He accused me of planning something, of blindsiding him. I told him the blindsiding had already happened and that I was done absorbing it. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in the quiet afterward, noticing how still I felt. Not numb, not angry, just resolved. The live stream had done what it was meant to do. It had drawn a clear moral line and dared anyone to cross it. By framing exclusion as virtue, Vanessa had made her position public and rigid. That rigidity would not survive contact with reality. Late that night, I received one more message from Vanessa, cheerful and clipped, reminding me that family events could be emotional and suggesting we reset after the trip. After the trip, the phrase repeated like a chorus. I did not respond. I added the message to my records and closed the folder. I slept deeply, knowing the next morning would not be about confrontation, but procedure. The lie had been broadcast. The stage had been set. And at dawn, when the captain asked for clearance, the truth would enter the room without raising its voice. I arrived at the marina just after sunrise, the air cool enough to sharpen every sound, every movement, every thought. The The water lay flat and metallic, reflecting a sky still undecided about color. I parked a short distance away and walked the rest, the wheels of my small suitcase clicking softly against the pavement, a sound that felt deliberate rather than rushed. I was not early by accident. I wanted to arrive before assumptions turned into momentum. From a distance, I saw the yacht's first clean lines, polished railings, the name I had chosen, etched into the stern in lettering I recognized instantly. For a moment, a familiar ache stirred, not regret but memory, the quiet pride I had felt the day I signed for it, the calm certainty that it was mine. As I drew closer, I saw them gathering near the dock, coffee cups in hand, laughter rising and falling in practiced bursts. Vanessa stood at the center, directing movement with small gestures, confident and unchallenged. Ethan lingered nearby, not beside her, not beside me, occupying the safe perimeter of someone who hoped not to be noticed choosing. I slowed my pace and adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle, reminding myself to breathe evenly. This was not an entrance. It was an arrival. Vanessa noticed me first. I saw it in the way her smile paused, the way her posture stiffened before she smoothed it away. For a fraction of a second, confusion crossed her face, followed quickly by irritation masked as concern. She took a step toward me and asked too brightly what I was doing there. I told her I was boarding. She laughed softly as if indulging a misunderstanding and said the guest list was finalized. I nodded and said I was aware. Around us, conversations faltered, eyes flicked between us, curiosity sharpening the air. Ethan moved closer, his expression tight, whispering my name as if warning me not to continue. I did not look at him. I handed my identification to the dock attendant without comment and waited. The attendant glanced at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen, his expression shifting from neutral to attentive. He excused himself and walked toward the captain, speaking in low tones. Vanessa's confidence did not falter yet. She told a nearby cousin that things were under control, that there had been a mix-up, that she would handle it. The word handle landed differently now, heavy with overuse. I stood quietly, hands resting on the suitcase, feeling the steadiness of the moment settle in. The captain approached with a tablet in hand, his demeanor professional, his voice even. He addressed me by name and asked for clearance before departure. The words were formal routine and devastating to the assumptions hanging in the air. Vanessa interrupted, insisting there must be an error, that she coordinated everything. The captain nodded once and said clearance required authorization from the sole owner. The phrase moved through the group like a sudden temperature change. Sole owner. Ethan's head snapped toward me, his face draining of color, confusion giving way to disbelief. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed as if the language itself had betrayed her. I did not speak. I did not need to. The captain turned the tablet toward me and asked for confirmation. I confirmed calmly using my full name, my voice steady enough to carry. The dock fell silent. Someone behind us dropped a cup, the sound sharp and incongruous. Vanessa protested her words, tumbling over one another, claiming misunderstanding family agreements tradition. The captain listened without expression and repeated that authorization rested with me. I met his eyes and said proceed. He nodded and signaled to the crew. The engines remained quiet, but the direction of the moment shifted unmistakably. Ethan stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if waiting for someone to explain what he had missed. I looked at him then, not with anger, but with clarity. This was the consequence of silence. The assumption that things would continue as they always had. Around us, the group began to murmur confusion, replacing certainty whispers threading through the space Vanessa had once controlled. I lifted my suitcase and stepped onto the ramp without looking back, the deck solid beneath my feet, the early light catching on polished wood. The captain greeted me again, this time with the respectful neutrality reserved for authority, and asked if I wished to depart on schedule. I said yes. Behind me, the lie they had built began to collapse under the weight of procedure, not spectacle. And I felt a calm settle over me that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with reclaiming ground I had never truly lost. The silence that followed my confirmation was not empty. It was weighted, the kind that presses on ears and forces people to hear their own thoughts. The captain-weighted tablet held steady eyes on me, rather than on the cluster of objections forming behind him. I took a breath and felt the moment lock into place. This was the point Margaret had described where assumption met procedure and lost. Vanessa tried again louder this time, insisting that family arrangements superseded paperwork, that everyone knew how these things worked, that this was being blown out of proportion. Her words stacked quickly and collapsed under their own speed. The captain did not argue. He did not explain. He repeated the same sentence calmly with the patience of someone trained to rely on policy rather than persuasion. Authorization rests with the sole owner. Ethan finally found his voice, stepping closer with a hand raised as if to pause the world. He asked me what was happening, demanded to know why this was being done here now, in front of everyone. His tone carried confusion. First, then panic, then something like anger. I answered him with the same calm I had used all morning. I told him the contract had been triggered by my exclusion and that control had reverted to me. I said the words clearly, without accusation, without flourish, because clarity does not need decoration. He shook his head, repeating that this could not be right, that no one had told him that this was not how families handled things. I said families had already handled it, and this was how contracts did. Vanessa scoffed, calling it a technicality, a loophole, something cold and unnecessary. I corrected her gently. I said it was a safeguard, and it existed for situations exactly like this. The dock attendant cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the argument like a small bell. The captain asked again if I wished to proceed. I said yes. That single syllable carried farther than any speech could have. Crew members began, their checks lines were adjusted, radios crackled. The machinery of departure moved forward with practiced ease, indifferent to the drama unfolding beside it. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice as if intimacy could restore control. She told me I was humiliating the family, that this would not end well, that people would remember how I behaved. I looked at her and said people were already remembering and that truth did not fear witnesses. Her face tightened, anger flashing through the composure she had perfected. She accused me of planning this, of ambushing them, of enjoying the spectacle. I told her I had planned for accuracy, not spectacle, and that the spectacle had been her choice when she made my absence public. Ethan interrupted again, asking me to stop to talk privately to fix this before it went too far. I told him it had gone far the moment he let someone else decide whether I belonged. The words were not shouted. They were measured, chosen, and final. Around us, the group fractured into murmurs and sidelong glances. A cousin stepped back as if distance might protect him from implication. An aunt avoided eye contact entirely. Someone whispered my name with a question mark at the end. The captain approached once more and asked if I wished to adjust the manifest. I said I would review it on board. He nodded, satisfied, and turned away. That was when the truth landed fully. Not because I said anything else, but because the process continued without asking permission from anyone who had assumed it would. The engines began to hum low and steady, a vibration felt through the soles of my shoes. Vanessa stood very still, the realization settling across her features that this was no longer a misunderstanding she could smooth over later. This was a record. Ethan looked at me as if searching for the version of me he recognized, the one who softened edges and absorbed discomfort. I met his gaze and held it. I was not punishing him. I was correcting a structure he had benefited from and refused to examine. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the weight of what he had allowed finally visible. I lifted my suitcase and moved past them, the deck welcoming in its familiar solidity. The captain greeted me by name and asked if there were any immediate instructions. I told him to proceed as scheduled and to note that all further requests should be directed to me. He acknowledged and moved to his station. As the lines were released and the gap between dock and hull widened, a ripple of movement passed through the group. Some stepped forward, others back. No one followed me on board without invitation. That restraint told me everything I needed to know. The truth had changed the room. From the aft deck, I looked out over the water as the marina began to slide away. The city remained where it was indifferent, while something inside me settled into alignment. This was not triumph. It was balance restored. The twist they never anticipated was not that I owned the yacht, but that ownership would speak when I chose not to shout. Once we cleared the marina, the noise fell away, replaced by the steady rhythm of water against the hull and the low hum of engines settling into pace. I stood alone at the rail not because I wanted distance, but because stillness had finally become possible. The city receded without ceremony, buildings shrinking into a backdrop that no longer demanded anything from me. A crew member approached to ask where I would like to be seated for the crossing. I thanked him and said I would remain on deck for now. He nodded unbothered and moved on. Authority, I realized, rarely needs explanation. It is recognized in how others adjust without being told. I felt the weight of eyes behind me, the unspoken recalibration happening in real time as people processed what they had witnessed. Conversations resumed in fragments, cautious and subdued, like a room after a power outage where no one is quite sure which switches still work. Vanessa had not come aboard. Neither had Ethan. The absence was notable, but not dramatic. It was simply a fact, and facts, once established, have a way of rearranging priorities. I breathed in the salt air and let the moment anchor itself. This was the first time in years I was not bracing for reaction, not anticipating dismissal, not rehearsing restraint. The quiet was not empty, it was earned. The captain checked in briefly to confirm our course and timing. I approved it and asked him to keep the schedule unchanged. He acknowledged and returned to the bridge. The professionalism of it all was almost comforting. No one asked how I felt. No one needed reassurance. The system worked as designed once authority was clear. I walked through the main salon, slowly noting the careful staging meant to signal hierarchy, the place settings that assumed certain people would sit in certain seats. I did not disrupt anything yet. Observation mattered. Control did not require haste. On the aft deck, I set my suitcase down and sat feeling the sun warm my shoulders as the yacht cut cleanly through open water. My phone buzzed once, then again. Messages from Ethan stacked up unread. I turned the device face down and let it rest. Silence used intentionally had a different texture. It was not avoidance, it was choice. A steward offered water. I accepted and thanked him, noticing how my name was used naturally now without qualification. It struck me then that the most powerful shift had not happened on the dock. It was happening here in the subtle reorientation of behavior, the quiet acknowledgement of reality. Ownership was no longer theoretical, it was operational. After a while, I asked for the manifest and reviewed it carefully, noting who had been added and who had been removed without my knowledge. The pattern was unmistakable. I made notes not with anger, but with precision. Documentation had become second nature. When I finished, I handed the manifest back with a request to hold all changes pending my approval. The steward confirmed. No questions asked. I felt the last trace of doubt dissolve. Mid-morning, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a family friend who had witnessed the scene. The text was brief, acknowledging what had happened and offering support without asking for explanation. I replied with a simple thank you. That mattered more than apologies from people who had benefited from my silence. I thought about Ethan then, about the look on his face when the captain spoke, the moment when assumption gave way to consequence. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. This was not a punishment. It was a boundary enforced. If there was to be repair, it would have to begin with recognition, not denial. The yacht continued forward, steady and indifferent, carrying me into a space that felt newly aligned. For years, I had tried to belong by accommodating a system that required my disappearance to function smoothly. Now, without raising my voice, I had changed the terms. I was not asking to be included. I was occupying what was already mine. As the sun climbed higher, the water brightened and the horizon opened into something wide and unclaimed. I stayed there, letting the motion settle into my body, aware that the real consequences would unfold later in conversations and decisions yet to come. But the central truth had already landed. When silence is mistaken for consent, it can be weaponized against you. When clarity replaces it, the weapon falls uselessly to the ground. I finished my water, stood, and walked forward, not toward anyone else, but toward the simple fact of being present without apology. The consequences did not arrive all at once, and that was perhaps the most revealing part. They came in small, unmistakable shifts, like a tide changing direction while people still argued about the weather. Within an hour of departure, my phone buzzed with a message from the marina office confirming that all future access requests would be routed through me directly. A second message followed from the brokerage acknowledging receipt of the notice drafted by Margaret and confirming my authority pending review. These were not emotional messages. They did not ask how I felt or what I intended. They simply recorded reality. That was when I understood how deeply authority depends on documentation rather than consensus. On board, the atmosphere continued to recalibrate. People spoke to me with a new carefulness, not deference exactly, but precision. Titles mattered now. Requests were phrased clearly. Assumptions were replaced with questions. I approved what made sense and deferred what did not, watching how quickly behavior adapted once the rules were explicit. It was not flattering. It was efficient. Midday, the captain informed me that Ethan had called requesting to board at the next port. The phrasing was neutral, the implication clear. I asked whether he had submitted a formal request. The captain said no. I told him to inform Ethan that all requests must be submitted in writing and reviewed. The captain acknowledged and ended the call. I felt a brief pang at that, not guilt, but recognition. Access once taken for granted feels like loss when it is conditioned. That feeling belonged to Ethan now. My phone buzzed again with a message from Vanessa, longer this time, alternating between indignation and appeal. She accused me of humiliating the family, of weaponizing paperwork, of undermining tradition. Then she pivoted, suggesting mediation, suggesting a private conversation, suggesting compromise. The sequence was familiar. Control, then conciliation. I read the message once and archived it without response. Documentation did not require debate. Later, a text arrived from Ethan that was shorter and quieter. He said he had not known about the clause. He said he felt blindsided. He said he wished I had talked to him first. I considered the words carefully. I typed a response and deleted it. Then I typed another. Finally, I sent a single sentence. I said that I had tried to talk and that silence had been chosen repeatedly, not by me. That was all. I did not explain further. The afternoon passed with a calm that felt unfamiliar but welcome. I reviewed emails, approved minor requests, and sat with a book I had not opened in months. The movement of the yacht was steady, purposeful, and I matched it. By late afternoon, the ripple effects began to reach farther. A mutual acquaintance messaged asking what had happened at the dock. I replied with a neutral statement of fact that I had asserted ownership after being excluded and that the matter was being handled. No blame. No embellishment. Facts have a way of traveling intact when you do not decorate them. As the sun lowered, I stepped back onto the deck and watched the light change across the water, thinking about how often women are told to be flexible to smooth edges, to absorb disruption quietly. Flexibility is praised until it becomes expectation, and expectation becomes entitlement. Today had marked the end of that cycle for me. Not because I raised my voice, but because I stopped yielding to a structure that depended on my absence. That evening, the captain updated me on the schedule and asked whether I wished to host dinner on board or keep things informal. I chose informal. I did not need ceremony. I needed alignment. As dusk settled, the yacht moved into open water, and I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving myself right, about honoring the instincts I had been trained to doubt. The consequences would continue to unfold in legal reviews, in conversations, in choices others would now have to make without the cushion of my compliance. I was ready for that. When night fell and the deck lights came on, casting soft reflections across the surface, I stayed outside a while longer, breathing evenly, grounded in the knowledge that ownership is not just a title. It is a responsibility to yourself first. And for the first time in a long while, I was meeting it without compromise. That night, with the engines carrying us steadily forward, I allowed myself to think beyond the immediate fallout and into what repair would actually require. Repair was not an apology delivered under pressure or a promise shaped by fear of loss. Repair meant acknowledgement of harm, ownership of choices, and a willingness to change behavior without conditions attached. Anything less would be performance. I sat at the small desk in the cabin and opened my notebook, the same one I had used to map timelines and patterns, and wrote a new heading: Boundaries Going Forward. Under it, I listed what access meant now, not as punishment, but as clarity. Written requests, clear purposes, no informal overrides, no third-party coordination, Authority would be exercised calmly and consistently, not to dominate, but to prevent the slow creep of entitlement from returning. When you make rules explicit, you remove the need for constant vigilance. That was the lesson I intended to keep. My phone vibrated again. Ethan had sent another message, longer, more reflective. He admitted that he had benefited from Vanessa managing family dynamics, that it had allowed him to avoid conflict, that he had mistaken peace for fairness. He said he was sorry for not protecting me when it mattered. I read it twice. The words were careful, perhaps sincere, perhaps late. I did not answer immediately. Timing matters when trust has been damaged. A response given too quickly can signal that consequences are temporary. I wanted to see whether remorse would hold without immediate reassurance. I closed the phone and went back on deck. The night air was cooler now, the stars faint, but present, the water dark and vast. I thought about how many moments I had second-guessed myself to keep things smooth, how often I had chosen quiet over clarity, believing it would lead to acceptance. Acceptance built on erasure is not acceptance at all. It is a bargain that only one side pays. The next morning, as we approached a small harbor, the captain informed me that Ethan had submitted a written request to board and speak privately. The formality of it struck me. He was learning the language of boundaries. I told the captain I would consider it after reviewing with counsel and asked him to acknowledge receipt without approval. The captain complied. I forwarded the request to Margaret with a brief note. Her reply advised caution, suggested neutral settings, and recommended documenting any meeting. I agreed. This was not about withholding. It was about structure. Later, Vanessa attempted a different tactic, posting a vague message about misunderstandings and forgiveness, positioning herself as magnanimous without addressing specifics. I noted it and moved on. Vague reconciliation is another way to avoid accountability. By midday, responses from the broader circle had settled into a pattern. Some reached out quietly with support. Some stayed silent. Some tried to extract details to satisfy curiosity. I offered the same neutral facts to all and declined to narrate pain for entertainment. The truth does not require amplification when it stands on its own. In the afternoon, I approved routine operations and deferred anything non-essential. Running the yacht felt like running my company had years ago. Calm decisions, clear records, no drama. Systems thrive when emotion does not interfere. As evening approached, I drafted a message to Ethan that balanced acknowledgement with expectation. I told him I had read his message. I told him repair would require sustained change, not a single conversation. I told him I was open to meeting in a structured setting with counsel present, and that until then, communication would remain limited and documented. I did not ask for agreement. I stated terms. When I sent it, I felt a quiet finality. This was not an ultimatum. It was a boundary that reflected reality. After dinner, I stood at the rail again, watching lights along the shore, blink on each one, a marker of someone else's evening, someone else's story. Mine felt steadier now. Less reactive, more intentional. Consequences were still unfolding, but they were unfolding on ground I had reclaimed. I was not trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was teaching myself a different way to live, one where clarity replaces accommodation and ownership is exercised without apology. The water carried us onward, and for the first time since this began, the future did not feel like something to brace for. It felt like something to choose. By the third morning, the noise had thinned to signal, and signal had become direction. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from habit, the kind built during years when progress depended on showing up before anyone else noticed. I made coffee, reviewed overnight updates, and approved routine requests with the same calm efficiency I brought to board meetings. What surprised me was how quickly order replaced chaos once expectations were explicit. People adjusted. Systems held. The drama others predicted never arrived because it had nothing left to feed on. Late morning, Margaret called to confirm the marina had logged my authority without objection and that the brokerage review was proceeding as expected. No emergency motions, no counters, just process. She reminded me that consistency would matter more than intensity now that credibility is built by doing the same reasonable thing every time. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the quiet satisfaction of alignment. Shortly after, Ethan sent a final message for the day. He acknowledged my terms and asked to schedule a meeting the following week with counsel present. The phrasing was careful, respectful, different. I replied that we could coordinate through attorneys and that I would consider dates once schedules aligned. The exchange was brief, factual, and telling. Boundaries had changed the language. In the afternoon, I walked the deck and noticed how the crew moved with confidence, how requests came through channels instead of whispers. Authority had normalized. That was the difference between power claimed and power exercised. I thought about Vanessa then, about the posts that had gone quiet, the sudden absence of curated statements. When narrative control fails, silence often follows. I did not gloat. I did not speculate. I documented. I had learned that attention is a resource best spent where it compounds. As the day warmed, I reviewed the manifest again and approved a revised seating arrangement for dinner, one that removed hierarchy and emphasized practicality. No head table, no signals, just space. The change was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Conversation flowed without performance. Laughter sounded unforced. It was a reminder that many conflicts persist not because people crave dominance, but because they follow scripts they never chose. Remove the script and the room changes. In the evening, I received a message from a young relative asking for advice about starting a business. The question was tentative, sincere, unburdened by family politics. I agreed to talk another time and felt a quiet sense of continuity that had nothing to do with blood. Legacy, I realized, is built when competence is shared, not hoarded. After dinner, I returned to the rail as the sun fell, writing a short note in my notebook beneath the heading I had started days earlier: Maintain structure. Document decisions. Keep access formal. Measure progress by behavior, not words. It was not a manifesto. It was maintenance. The work of keeping a life intact is often unglamorous, but it is steady. As night settled, the water darkened to a reflective calm, and I allowed myself a moment to feel the full arc of what had shifted. Not the spectacle at the dock, not the messages, not the posts, but the internal recalibration that followed. I had stopped negotiating my reality. I had stopped translating disrespect into misunderstanding. The result was not isolation. It was clarity. Before turning in, I sent a brief update to Margaret confirming availability for the following week and thanking her for her counsel. I powered down my phone and let the cabin quiet envelop me. There would be more conversations ahead, more choices to make, but they would be made on terms I had set and could sustain. The engines hummed steady and reliable, and I slept with the ease that comes when boundaries are no longer theoretical. They are lived, enforced, and ordinary. The meeting took place the following week in a neutral conference room overlooking a stretch of water that felt deliberately chosen, calm enough to discourage theatrics, public enough to enforce restraint. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to make a point, but to ground myself in the space before anyone else's energy entered it. Margaret sat beside me, a slim folder in front of her, posture, relaxed expression, unreadable. When Ethan walked in, he looked different. Not chastened exactly, but stripped of the casual certainty he had worn for years. He greeted us politely and took his seat across the table, hands folded, eyes flicking briefly to the documents and then back to my face. No one rushed to speak. Silence did the work first. Margaret opened by outlining the purpose of the meeting in precise terms: clarification of authority, review of conduct, pathways forward contingent on compliance. No accusations, no history lesson, just scope. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, absorbing the language as if learning a new dialect. When it was his turn, he spoke carefully. He acknowledged that the exclusion had occurred. He acknowledged that he had not intervened. He said he had underestimated the impact and overestimated the value of keeping peace. The words were measured, possibly rehearsed, but not dismissive. I waited. Accountability is revealed not by what is admitted, but by what is offered next. He said he wanted to make things right. Margaret asked him how. The question landed cleanly. He paused, then said he would support a restructuring of ownership that reflected contribution, not assumption. He said he would no longer defer to his sister on matters that involved me or assets I controlled. He said he was willing to put those commitments in writing. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Not relief, but recognition. This was the first time he had translated remorse into terms that could be measured. I spoke then not to counter, but to clarify. I said repair would require consistency over time, not a single agreement. I said access would remain formal and documented. I said any attempt to minimize or reframe what had happened would reset the process. I did not ask if he agreed. I stated what would be required for trust to rebuild. He nodded and said he understood. Margaret summarized next steps, including a written addendum and a cooling period during which communication would remain structured. Ethan agreed without objection. The meeting ended without raised voices, without dramatic gestures, without closure wrapped in sentiment. It ended with clarity. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being hidden. In the days that followed, changes appeared where words alone would not have reached. Ethan followed the agreed channels. Requests came in writing. Boundaries were observed without commentary. When his family attempted to draw him into side conversations, he redirected them to the documented process. Vanessa went quiet, not conciliatory, not combative, just absent. That absence spoke volumes. Control, once challenged, often retreats before it reforms. I did not pursue an apology from her. I did not need it. The system no longer rewarded her tactics. Weeks passed, and the absence of crisis became its own confirmation. Work resumed its familiar rhythm. Decisions were made, logged, reviewed. The yacht operated smoothly under clear authority. At home, conversations with Ethan were cautious but respectful, stripped of the old shorthand that had concealed avoidance. We spoke less but said more. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he admitted that he had mistaken loyalty for silence, and that silence had cost him credibility. I listened without interrupting. Repair, I had learned, is not something you rush toward. It is something you allow to prove itself. I returned often to the note my father had once written, the one I had found tucked away and forgotten. Do not fight for a seat. Build your own table. For years, I had interpreted it as ambition. Now I understood it as governance. Building your own table means setting rules that make room for dignity, including your own. It means refusing to negotiate your presence. The story others tried to write about me lost its power the moment I stopped responding to it. What replaced it was quieter and sturdier. A life governed by clarity, a relationship conditioned on accountability, an asset operated with transparency. There was no final speech, no viral moment, no public reckoning beyond the dock where it had begun. There was simply a shift sustained and unremarkable, like a course correction that keeps a vessel steady long after the storm has passed. And in that steadiness, I found something I had not been seeking but deeply needed. Peace that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Time did what time does best when clarity replaces chaos. It normalized what once felt impossible. The weeks after the meeting did not bring fireworks or sweeping declarations, but they did bring consistency. And consistency has a quiet authority of its own. The addendum Margaret drafted was executed without delay, precise in language and narrow in scope, restoring sole operational control to me and formalizing boundaries that had once existed only in my head. Ethan signed without protest. The act itself mattered less than the absence of resistance. It signaled acceptance of a new reality rather than performance of remorse. At home, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. There were no more assumptions disguised as jokes, no more deflections when topics turned uncomfortable. When family matters arose, Ethan asked instead of informing. When decisions involved shared space, he waited for agreement instead of proceeding by inertia. These were small changes, but small changes repeated become structure. Vanessa remained quiet, her social presence pared back to generic updates that said nothing and invited no response. When she did reach out once weeks later, the message was careful and nonspecific, expressing hope that everyone could move forward. I acknowledged receipt without engaging the premise. Moving forward does not require erasing the past. It requires not repeating it. On the yacht, operations continued smoothly. Crew members adjusted to the clarity with relief rather than resentment. And the absence of back-channel directives reduced friction. Requests arrived in writing. Approvals were logged. Schedules held. Order, I learned, is a kindness to everyone involved when it is applied evenly. I spent more time on board than I had before, not to assert presence, but to enjoy the space without bracing for someone else's claim. I read on deck in the afternoons, met with colleagues by phone, and watched how the horizon changes when you stop scanning for threats. The water does not demand anything, it simply reflects what is there. Friends asked whether I felt vindicated. I told them I felt aligned. Vindication requires an audience. Alignment does not. It is internal and durable. At work, the experience sharpened my leadership in unexpected ways. I formalized processes I had once managed intuitively, documented decision rights, and clarified escalation paths. The result was not rigidity, but resilience. Teams functioned better when authority was explicit and fairness visible. I thought often about how easily competence is overshadowed when it is quiet, how quickly narratives fill the gaps left by restraint. That awareness made me more deliberate, not louder. One evening, as I organized the drawer where I kept documents and notes, I found the early timeline I had created during those first sleepless nights. Dates, times, words. It read like a different life. I did not destroy it. I archived it labeled clearly and stored it where it belonged. Not as a grievance, but as a record. Records are not for reliving. They are for remembering accurately. Ethan and I continued to rebuild cautiously. Counseling sessions focused less on feelings and more on patterns, on how avoidance masquerades as peace, and how loyalty becomes harmful when it shields harm. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he did so with specificity. Progress was uneven but real. Trust, I learned, returns in increments that can be measured only over time. I did not rush it. I did not need to. The urgency had passed. The structure remained. On a quiet morning, I stood at the rail again, coffee warming my hands, and thought about the woman I had been at the start of this story, negotiating her presence, translating exclusion into misunderstanding, believing silence was generosity. She had done the best she could with the information she had. I did not judge her. I thanked her for surviving long enough for clarity to arrive. What replaced her was not harder or colder. It was steadier. The final lesson was simple and enduring. When you stop asking to be included and start operating from what you have built, the world adjusts. Not because it is fair, but because clarity forces it to. The ending did not arrive with applause or reconciliation speeches, and that felt appropriate because the real shift had never been about them. It had been about me. Months after the dock, after the meetings, after the paperwork settled into its proper places, life resumed its ordinary rhythms, and ordinary no longer felt like something I had to earn. The house sounded the same in the mornings, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of the coffee maker, but I moved through it differently, without scanning for tension, without preparing explanations in advance. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. The yacht became what it had always been meant to be, not a symbol to defend, but a space to inhabit. Friends visited without hierarchy. Conversations unfolded without choreography. Laughter rose naturally, unperformed, unrecorded. No one announced legacy. It simply existed in the way people treated one another when rules were clear and respect was assumed. That quiet transformation mattered more than any public correction ever could have. Ethan and I continued the slow work of rebuilding, not with promises, but with habits. He learned to pause where he once deferred. He learned to speak when silence had been his shield. I learned that forgiveness is not an event, but a process that follows accountability, not precedes it. We were not the same couple we had been before, and that was not a loss. It was an upgrade in honesty, even when honesty felt uncomfortable. Vanessa remained at a distance, and that distance was no longer a wound. It was a boundary doing its job. Not everyone needs access. Not everyone deserves proximity. I stopped measuring progress by whether she acknowledged me and started measuring it by whether her behavior could affect me. It could not. That was the clearest metric of all. One afternoon, I received a message from a young woman I barely knew, someone who had seen part of the situation unfold and reached out quietly. She wrote that watching me hold my ground without shouting had changed how she thought about power, that she had always believed strength had to be loud. I replied simply telling her that strength is often procedural, unglamorous, and deeply effective. I meant it. Looking back, I understood that the most dangerous myth I had believed was that kindness required silence. Kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It is surrender. Boundaries enforced calmly create the conditions where kindness can exist without self-erasure. I kept that truth close as I moved forward, applying it not just to family, but to work friendships and the expectations I placed on myself. The story others tried to write about me lost relevance the moment I stopped reading it. What remained was the life I was building in real time, governed by clarity, sustained by structure, and grounded in self-respect. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exile, no victory lap. There was simply a table I had built sturdy and intentional, with seats offered thoughtfully rather than by default. On a quiet evening, as the sun lowered and the water caught fire with reflected light, I stood barefoot on the deck and felt something settle fully into place. I was no longer reacting to what had been taken from me. I was living from what I had claimed. Ownership, I realized, is not about control over others. It is about responsibility to yourself. And once you accept that responsibility, the world adjusts, not because it wants to, but because it has to.